Greetings historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon. So today we're going to be looking into a species that has actually, along with a few others, been a constant in every single Spyro iteration. However, what sets them apart from the rest is both the power they wield and the fact that the main character actually belongs to their species. In today's video, we're going to talk about the dragons, both in the original and reignited universes. However, unlike most of my videos, there won't really be any speculation as they really are going to appear in the next game, and there's not exactly too much to speculate about. Unless I made a video actually talking about the next Spyro game in general. And I like the video covering their home, which would be the Dragon Realms and the Dragon Kingdom. We're going to be looking into their culture and their history as a civilization. So without further ado, let's get right into the video. So before we start, I have to get a couple things out of the way for people who might not necessarily know what really sets the dragons apart in Spyro. And this would generally be how their biology seems to work. In the original Spyro trilogy, they have been noted to be the source of magic, or at least a source of magic that we know of. Wherever they go, the land seems to have an abundance of this energy, and they actually use this to go ahead and fuel some of their technology. A particular one that many people might know is actually portal technology. Now let's move on to something that's more about their culture and the dragons themselves rather than their own technology. Something that's very prominent in their culture is something called the Year of the Dragon Festival, something the dragons celebrate every 12 years. This would seem to be centered around their own biology, as it's actually how long it takes for a dragon egg to hatch in the Spyro universe. And this would more likely be the reason why, at least in universe, it's called the Year of the Dragon. What this Year of the Dragon Festival entails is dragons getting together and fairies, another species in the Spyro universe, return the eggs that the dragons have bestowed upon them 12 years prior. Anyway, since the fairies are known to have a presence in the Forgotten Realms, it would seem that the possibility of the fairies participating in the Year of the Dragon Festival were even possible millennia before what we actually saw in the games. Now in Dragon Society, there are a few notable statuses. The primary one that everyone knows would be the Dragon Elder. However, what task the Dragon Elder takes on can be multiple things. A notable one in the old canon is actually called the Dragon Sensei, who teaches other dragons the knowledge of Dragon Kata, a martial art that the dragons actually came up with that binds magic and physical attacks into one. A few small lore pieces to note about them is their attitude as a species, as they usually tend to be more peaceful in nature, rather than what some depictions paint them out to be. And this other one is not necessarily about their traditions, but is more about what happens as a dragon grows. Dragons start off by walking on 4 legs, but as they grow older, their ability to stand on 2 legs grows, until adulthood they actually become bipedal, or can choose. I'm not quite sure how that works. So with that out of the way, we can finally get into their history, which brings us to a land of which name has been forgotten to time, and now is simply called the Forgotten Realms. This land was actually the home of the dragons 1,000 years prior to modern day events in Spyro. And it would seem at this point that the dragons and their neighbors lived in relative peace. However, the dragons shared this land with a malevolent ruler, another user of magic, and one that led an army of creatures known as Rhinox. This character, or crocodile, would later be known as the Sorceress. Now what exactly the Sorceress thought of the dragons all the way back then isn't known, but from what I can tell in Spyro 3, she seems to rather pride herself on being the most powerful magic user in the Forgotten Realms, and maybe, at least with the dragons being there, so I'm not exactly sure she was too fond of the idea of the dragons being in the Forgotten Realms. And at some point, I would imagine she would have planned to try and get rid of them. However, this would become a problem for her, and it would be rather ironic that she would do this, mainly because of the fact that, well, they generate the magic she actually uses to claim to be the most powerful sorceress or magic user in the Forgotten Realms. However, at the time, she didn't know this, and she would proceed with a plan that would eventually get rid of the dragons and change their history forever. Now what was this moment? Well, this moment was, eventually, a meeting that was between a dragon elder named Aster and the sorceress herself. And whether or not this was planned from the start, or if it was something that just happened after some sort of argument, either way, the result is the same. Aster and the rest of the dragons are banished to the other side of the world. Now, for speculation, I have a couple thoughts on this. Mainly, why did the banishment take place, and why did the sorceress wait so long to do it? Now, my thought on the subject is, maybe there was some argument over a piece of land or an object, maybe even a magically infused object, and whoever possessed it might have gotten a boost in magic, and the sorceress had either stolen it from someone or stolen it from the dragons. However, maybe an argument ensued, and eventually the dragons were banished. Now, a second thought is, maybe she just had to store up enough energy to actually do this in the first place. And then after she had the potential energy to do this, she summoned Aster to her throne room, and then banished him and the rest of the dragons. However, either way, the dragons eventually were banished from their original home, and sent off to the other side of the world to try to figure out how to live in this new environment. Now, this is the case in Reignited. There are actually two things in the original timeline that describe different ways the dragons actually went to the other side of the world. The first one is in something called The Legends of Dragonkind, and describes a group of dragons that fled the Forgotten Realms after a natural catastrophe struck the lands. They would cross the vast oceans of their world, and eventually found a place that would become their refuge. It would be here that they established their first settlement in this new land, Dragon Village. And while the village was being built, the most senior of the dragons in the colony came together on a secluded hilltop and formed what would become the governing body of the Dragon Kingdom, the Council of Elders. It'd also be in this village that they built something called the Dragon Dojo, which would actually later serve as the home for the Council of Elders and the Dragon Senseis. Now, the second piece of lore that pertains to what might have happened either between the banishment and Spyro 1, or something that happened before, actually is a story about a character known as the Great Sea Dragon. In this story, it depicts the Great Sea Dragon carrying her young across the Great Sea, presumably the same one that these other dragons actually traveled on. She'd flee the Forgotten Realms for whatever reason. It's not actually stated why, but she would end up in what would later become Dragon Shores. But due to the exhaustion and the long trip, she would actually perish on the beach. And later, there would be a monument placed where she lay in her honor. Now, this idea of the Great Sea Dragon raises some questions, mainly when it happened and why exactly she didn't just take a portal. Now, for when it happened, there are either two cases, and each one's kind of interchangeable. The first one is when this natural catastrophe happened, and the second one is around the time the banishment happened. So let's say maybe a couple thousand years to 1,000 years, respectively. So let's say at some point that the Great Sea Dragon had heard of this group that traveled to the other side of the world. And for whatever reason, she thought that it was a better idea to take her and her children to the other side of the planet to keep them safe from either the remnants of this natural catastrophe or maybe even the sorceress. Now, the reason why she didn't use a portal can be for two reasons. The first one is, well, she just flat out couldn't. Maybe during this natural catastrophe, the portals are somehow knocked out of commission. And the second option is more along the lines of if it happened during the banishment, which would be that maybe she didn't want to be tracked, either for the safety of herself and her children, or even those already in the Dragon Kingdom. Someone might have suspected that they used this portal to go to this new land. However, that's really the only thing I can come up with, but if you have any ideas, let me know down in the comments below. Now, small tangent here, but in The Legend of Dragonkind, it states that the Council of Elders have existed for many millennia. But as Spyro 3 states, the dragons weren't actually banished until 1,000 years before Spyro, not many thousands of years. Which either brings up an inconsistency in Spyro lore, raises questions about the validity of this actual legend, or it might indicate that the Dragon Kingdom actually existed far before the banishment, and the dragons already had a settlement on the other side of the world. But if you have any ideas for what this could mean, leave them down in the comments below. Now, what exactly stopped the dragons from going back to the Forgotten Realms? Now, I've seen other people talk about this before, and I tend to agree with what they have to say. And the reason that people give is, well, the dragons either were too scared, or they rather wanted to remain a peaceful species, so didn't want to seek a quarrel with the sorceress after this. Which, quite honestly, I think it might have been a mix of both. At least for the immediate time after the sorceress had banished them. Now, to get slightly on track with the Reignited timeline, maybe it was after this new wave of dragons coming to the Dragon Kingdom, the part of the kingdom would become what we know as the Dragon Realms. 5 or rather 6 worlds, separated by skill set, but combined as one entity. Unlike the Dragon Kingdom, the Dragon Realms leadership seems to be rather different, with each realm actually having its own leader, rather than having a higher governing body govern all 5 of them. The Dragon Realms would consist of 5 main worlds, or rather 6 if you count one of them that I'll mention later. And these main worlds would be called Artisans, Peacekeepers, Magic Crafters, Beastmakers, and Dreamweavers. The range of specific skills in the Artisans actually include quite a lot. Be that a scientist, a scholar, a cook, a philosopher, an entertainer, a carpenter, quite literally anything under the sun that generally makes life in the Dragon Realms better, or leads to technological or philosophical advancement. The Peacekeepers, unlike the Artisans, would be more militant, and be the warriors of the Dragon Realms, and maybe even at some point, if need be the warriors of the Dragon Kingdom. Now the last 3 are more focused on magic. The next one is the Magic Crafters, and they focus more on making magic-infused items. Of what variety, I'm not quite sure. The Beastmakers use magic to conjure up various creatures. Again, for what purpose, I'm not entirely sure. And last but not least would be the Dreamweavers, and they had a special task among the dragons. They would, instead of making magically infused objects for making creatures, use magic to protect the dragons from nightmares, which actually, in retrospect, gives them a pretty insane power. Over time, as the dragons spread, they would meet a plethora of new species. However, 2 of notoriety in their story are the Dragonflies and the Norks. The Dragonflies and the dragons would actually form a societal bond, with the tradition actually being formed around the Dragonflies, and this would be called the Rite of Passage, taking place 1 year after the Year of the Dragon. This would involve a hatchling from the Year of the Dragon being given a dragonfly companion, and since dragonflies seem to be only native to the Dragon Realms, I imagine it would have been the dragons in exile that would have formed this tradition in the first place. Now on the other hand, the Norks, at least for some of them, might have had a rather different reaction to their new peaceful neighbors. Some Norks would join the dragons, and actually help the dragons in certain ways. Primarily the one we see is in Spyro 2, where they're actually operating an amusement park in Dragon Shores. However, there was one that didn't take the dragons settling in this land too kindly, and this would be Nasty Nork. Nasty, throughout the years, would try to cause trouble for the Dragon Realms. However, eventually, Nasty would be caught by the dragons and thrown into the dragon junkyard. However, Nasty wouldn't take this defeat lying down. He observed that the dragons were producing magic, and that this could be used. So he studied the energy, and eventually started to figure out how he could use it to his advantage in the future. However, this is not the only place in the Dragon Kingdom that trouble was brewing. In fact, there was a member on the Council of Elders, a dragon elder named Red, that suddenly went missing. But if you've seen or heard about the story of the sorcerer, you would know that Red went to a place called the Sorcerer's Land, and actually ended up being brainwashed and sent back to the Dragon Kingdom, this time as a puppet. And after an incident in which one of the other elders' homes was actually smashed by a creature that he summoned from the Shadow Realm, a mirrored dimension to what we know as the normal realms, Red was banished from the Dragon Kingdom. And seemingly for now, his meddling with dark magic would seem to stop. Now, years later, presumably during a Year of the Dragon, 12 years prior to what we know as Spyro 3, or Year of the Dragon, a larvae would be crawling around an egg, one belonging to a particular purple dragon who would soon hatch and later become the hero of the Dragon Realms. The larvae being Sparks, and the egg, of course, belonging to Spyro. That's going to be it for the history of the dragons leading all the way up to Spyro 1. Now, I won't be doing a part 2 to this, mainly because I'm actually going to be covering a character that essentially has seen all the events that follow this, and will almost act as a Dragon Part 2 along with his own story. But anyway, that's going to be it for me. Now, just because I didn't go ahead and speculate how exactly the dragons could play a part in the next Spyro game, doesn't mean that you can't. If you have any ideas, go right ahead and leave them down in the comments. If you want to stick around, feel free to, and I'll see you all in the next lore video. Stay safe, historians.